Well, thanks, Eden, and thank you for that lovely reading. It's fantastic to be with you tonight to discuss one of the amazing characters that the Old Testament has recorded for us. And you've had the privilege of looking at Joshua's life over the course of the year, and I'm sure you're all pumped with Joshua's dynamic life, his energy, his zeal, his passion, his determination to help God's people into the kingdom. And that's what we want to consider tonight as we look at the legacy that Joshua left. And that legacy goes right through to the year 2018, the month October. His legacy is left on record. Joshua didn't know that we would be sitting here all of these thousands of years later being inspired by his life. He had no idea that a record of his life was going to be written for succeeding generations. And what an amazing thing to think we've got the ability to be inspired by Joshua. From the divine perspective, a record has been kept and preserved so that we can see what drove this man and what is his legacy. He's going to die. He's an old man. He's the oldest man alive because you know the story, you've been through it. All of those above 20 had to die, condemned by God because they got to the borders of the land and 10 faithless spies made the people so anxious about the impossibility of gaining their inheritance that God condemned all of Joshua's peers, all of his generation, and his parents and his grandparents. They all had to die. And you know, if we translated Joshua's experience into our day, it'd be like Christ coming. We go to Sinai, and as a result of some things that just go wrong, Jesus says, I'm sorry, we're going to have to delay this. Sorry. But I'm going to send you back to Adelaide, and you're going to have to stay there for another 38 years until your dads and mums and your grandparents are all dead. So you're going to have to wait until the year 2056 before you can get into the kingdom. That was Joshua's personal experience. Do you think leadership might have been something pretty important to Joshua? Do you think the lack of leadership that his peers and his parents' generation and his grandparents' generation, do you think the lack of their spiritual leadership might have burned some impression into Joshua's mind? You imagine if that happened to you. And you desperately wanted to get out of the sand, out of the tent, out of the wilderness with all of these complaining, murmuring, faithless people, and you wanted to just get into the kingdom, get a block of land, build your house, settle in there and enjoy the kingdom. And God says, look, you could have had it now, but you know, your folks really have let you down. And you're going to have to wait till the year 2056. See you in 38 years. No wonder Joshua understood the pain of bad, poor spiritual leadership. Look what it cost him. And he understood the need to be a leader, and he left a legacy of a faithful example, of strong spiritual leadership, of courage in the face of an enemy. And his dying exhortation is recorded for us in Joshua chapters 23 and 24 that we'll consider tonight. He gets together all Israel, and he gets together the leaders of the nation of Israel. He gets their elders, their heads, their judges, their officers, all of the leadership. What is leadership? If we were to define leadership scripturally or biblically, what would leadership be? And my best attempt to come up with a definition of what true leadership is the ability to change the course of human history. That's my definition. You can probably come up with a better one. That's my definition of leadership. The ability to change the course of human history, personally, And as far as we are concerned, we want each other in the kingdom. Put up your hand if you want to see all of your peers, all of your fellow young people in the kingdom. Put up your hand as high as you can. You really want that to happen. Okay, you know that our current course of history is we live a curse. And God has cursed humanity. And we have a nature that leads us to sin, and a nature that is condemned to death. Leadership changes the course of human history because it changes a curse into a blessing. It changes sin-prone nature into divine nature. It changes the sentence of death to the gift of immortality. That's what true leaders do. That's what Joshua did. And look at the immediate effect of his leadership on the nation. Just come with me to Deuteronomy chapter 31. And here's the dying words of Moses, who was Joshua's predecessor. And he gets together in Deuteronomy 31 and verse 28, all the elders of the tribes and the officers, same group of people. He gets the leadership together. Deuteronomy 31 and verse 28. And he's going to speak these words in their ears and call heaven and earth to record against them. And this is what Moses said. And Joshua is in the audience. I know that after my death you will utterly corrupt yourselves and turn aside from the way which I have commanded you, and evil will befall you in the latter days because you will do evil in the sight of Yahweh to provoke him to anger through the work of your hands. Now you imagine Joshua listening to these words, the legacy of Moses, and all of the leadership is listening to Moses. And Moses, by inspiration, gives a prophecy of corruption and apostasy that's going to set in the day they bury him, or they didn't bury him, the day they lose him because the angel buried him out of their sight. Now, just come across to Joshua 24, just the next chapter that was read for us. Talk about changing the course of human history. These are amazing words. In Joshua chapter 24 and verse 31, we read these amazing words. Israel served Yahweh all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that overlived Joshua and which had known all the works of Yahweh which he had done for Israel. Now, I don't know about you young people, but that is changing the course of human history. Because Joshua's leadership and the leadership of those leaders that Joshua inspired staved off and delayed the fulfillment of Moses' prophecy for 2 generations. That's changing the course of human history. Moses' prophecy did not come to pass when Moses died, because Joshua and the elders that overlived Joshua delayed the fulfillment of corruption in the ecclesia for 2 more generations. That's leadership. And if we're in the same place today, and pray God we're not, where our parents and our grandparents have lost the way, it's the younger generation in Joshua's day that changed the course of history. The younger generation. Now Joshua was an old man, of course, as we know, but Joshua was a young man when he spied out the land. And his inspirational leadership gathered together a group that were younger than him, yes, but that were still teenagers. Those that were above 20 were condemned to die, but the younger, they were the ones that got into the promised land, and their parents and grandparents lost the promised land. So young people, don't sit here thinking we cannot do anything about the truth in Adelaide, because scripturally speaking, that is wrong. Scripturally speaking, there have been, and Joshua's example is one of many, there have been young people that have led revolutions and reformations in the ecclesia when the older generation had lost their way and corrupted from the truth. So don't think that you can just ignore the message and the legacy of Joshua's example and think it doesn't apply to you. It applies to mum and dad and uncle and auntie and grandma and grandpa. No, please don't lose the message. of the legacy of Joshua. Young people, you can make a difference. You can change the course of history. Now, leadership is something that is really a fact for every single one of us. All of us are leaders. In a way, we're all leaders. Because, do you know, whether you have a good example or a bad example, I can guarantee you there will be people that will be following you and copying you and doing what you do and saying what you say. You are being followed. You're a leader. Whether you like it or not, we are all leaders to some extent. We just have to decide whether we're going to have a good influence on other people or a bad influence on other people, because that's what we choose. But we can't choose whether to be a leader or not, because we're all leaders in some way or other. And there's many examples in the scriptures of people that had followed examples many years after those examples were dead and buried. So your example might actually affect people long after you're dead. Joshua's has. So don't think that, I'm not in a leadership position. No, you might not be in a leadership position, but you're a leader because people will follow you. Sunday school management, you might be a superintendent or secretary of a Sunday school. You might be a Sunday school teacher. These are leadership positions appointed in the ecclesia. You might be a committee member in a youth group or suburban. You might be a secretary of a committee. And there are a few examples of appointed leadership. But if we're leaders, we need to be leaders. Of course, husbands are leaders in marriages. Parents are leaders in families, bringing up their children. Leadership is part of the way that God has made us. He made us, He created us to be leaders. When He made us after the image, in the image and after the likeness of the Elohim, it was to have, what's the word? To have dominion. Dominion is leadership. Dominion is rulership over all forms of the lower creation that are governed by instinct. Over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, the beast of the field, and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. God created man to be a leader. And all of us in this room are in the image and after the likeness of the Elohim. We're leaders. God created us to be leaders. Leadership is something that we are created with. And God made us that way so that we can understand that it's all in the mind. That's where leadership is. Leadership is a state of mind. And so the Proverbs 16 verse 32 says, the greatest victory you can ever have. Don't worry about kings who take cities. They're counted as heroes. Even ancient ones like Alexander the Great, who's a great-great-great-great-grandfather of mine. No, I'm joking. I can't claim to be a descendant of Alexander the Great. But for all of the conquests of men over cities, the Proverbs say, a man that can conquer human nature, can conquer the flesh, can rule over his spirit, is the greatest warrior, the greatest leader, the greatest conqueror of all time. And we know that's true because who was that man that did that? Jesus Christ. And He was the greatest man that ever lived because He wrought the greatest victory that any man could ever wrought. He ruled His spirit. And that's what we need to do. To be leaders, we need to exercise dominion. So Joshua set before the nation of Israel the promised land. As we know, his conquests destroyed the power base of the Canaanites and the nations that were divided in the land that was to be their inheritance. But he said that inheritance now was up to them to go out and to conquer tribe by tribe. So he had done like our Lord Jesus Christ. His victory had established a basis upon which we could have our own personal victory. Israel was in the same situation where the tribes now, on the basis of Joshua's victories, now had to go tribe by tribe as they were allotted by Joshua to seize their inheritance by war, by killing an enemy. We've never experienced, or at least I don't think any of us have experienced, hand-to-hand combat in the battle like Joshua. We might find it actually difficult to slice people up in pieces. We might find it difficult to actually emotionally, let alone psychologically, and let alone physically survive in the battlefield. Joshua was a hardened warrior. But there are principles, of course, that physical warfare teaches us in the warfare that we wage, because our inheritance is also going to be achieved by our personal victory over an enemy. And there's an inheritance. Jesus Christ said, you overcome, you're going to inherit all things. And I will be his God and he shall be my son. So we have an inheritance before us, but the way to achieve that inheritance is to overcome the enemy. Overcome the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, a personal victory ruling the spirit. The victory that our Lord Jesus Christ fought and won. We've got to follow in his steps. We've got to crucify the flesh with the affections and lusts. Our inheritance is there for us to seize, and it's going to be seized by a war that's going to be won. But we have to have our eyes set on that inheritance. Leaders are visionaries. They live the future. Leaders do not live in the present. They have a dream, they have a vision, they eat, sleep, dream, they are in the future. And that's what drives them every day. And that's why the proverb is so powerful. Because if you have a vision, your mind will take you there. Our imagination and the resources that God has given us will carve out a pathway, a route to get us to that destination. But if you don't have a vision, if you haven't burnt in your mind the inheritance that you want with all of your friends in the kingdom, you'll perish. You'll fall by the wayside. Got to have a vision. You've got to know where you're heading. How many times do we see this example? How many times have we used this example of navigation? Simple. We all do it. What do? You set into your GPS the destination. Then the GPS comes up and says, this is how you get there. Just follow my directions. Same technology. God says, set your GPS to the kingdom. And a route will emerge in your mind and through the scriptures and through God's influence in your mind that will get you there. But don't have that vision. Don't put anything in the destination. Just say, you're going nowhere. I'll tell you, you'll get there in no time. And a lot of people are going nowhere in life. And they wonder why they've already arrived when they haven't departed. Because they're going nowhere. We are going somewhere. We're looking towards our inheritance, just like Joshua was. And we can visualize it because we're given a vision of that. And we need to make sure that that vision stays alive, and a route to that destination will emerge, and we'll follow that route because our destination is where we've set our GPS. Now, you and I know, as we look at these verses, so verse 3, verse 5, verse 9, and verse 10, and I've clustered these together because they don't necessarily flow, because Joshua is giving his last final speech in his legacy to the nation. But I've clustered these verses together because you can see what stands out, and you can see that there's no way that we are going to get our inheritance on our own or in our own strength. It's Yahweh, your God. And you'll notice the difference between the past tense rather, and the present or the future tense. So Joshua is encouraging the people to look back and say, what have you seen? Who has given you the victory to this point? Yahweh, your God. Well, that's the reason why you should have confidence that, like he's proved himself to you and given you superhuman strength to achieve the impossible, The Israeli army was superhuman in its achievements. There was no human explanation as to why they could wrought so many victories against so insurmountable odds, and that has continued to the present day in the Six-Day War and the War of Independence and other wars. The Jewish people have had a supernatural assistance in their battles and victories, and we look back at the past and we see that they have not been able to achieve those feats of victory in their own strength. And that, Joshua said, should give you confidence that God will be with you in the future. He has and He will. He has and He will. And that's the lesson that we need also to remember, young people, because we're not going to get into the kingdom in our own strength. The nation of Israel's history is written so that we can have confidence that the God that was the God of Israel that helped them is the God that can help you. Because I know there's no way I can gain the kingdom in my own strength. There's no way I can overcome my own personal enemy in my own strength. I would love to be able to stand up here and say, I can, I can't. But I believe God can. And I believe He will fulfill His promise, and His past is evidence that we can have faith and confidence that He will get us into the kingdom, because He will help us overcome. In our own personal battle against sin, He'll be there because He's promised. You see, I've highlighted that in blue in verse 5 and verse 10. And God never breaks His promises. People may let you down and break their promises to you, and that might really hurt you and disappoint you. God will never. It's a matter of a promise that He's made. I'm going to get you into the kingdom. You set your vision on the kingdom. You want the kingdom, I'll help you get there. It's a promise, a personal promise that God makes to each one of us. But we've got to know who we're fighting against. Because our overcoming personally is actually part of a global war that's been going on since Genesis 3:15, when God declared that He will exterminate the seed of the serpent by giving power to the seed of the woman. And when we come into the arena and start fighting, we're part of a global war that's been going on since Genesis 3 verse 15. And as soon as we say we're on God's side, we're guaranteed a victory, because He's said that He will guarantee victory, that one day the seed of the woman will totally exterminate the seed of the serpent. Because there's only two seeds. There's only two families. There's only two classifications of people that exist on this planet. Seed of the woman, seed of the serpent. That's the only two. Only two. And they're at war because God declared war between them. And the seed of the woman is going to have victory over the seed of the serpent. So when we enter into the arena of the battlefield, in our own personal struggle, pick your sides right. Because if you want to remain seed of the serpent, then you've picked the losing side. Might not appear like that today, but because I believe what the Bible says, the day will soon come when the smart people, the wise people that have chosen to be on God's side will have an eternal victory. And that's where Joshua will be, and that's where Moses will be, and that's where all the faithful will be as well. How do you overcome? How do you have victory over the words, over the voices in your head that say, I'm too tired to go to the meeting. I'm just going to lay down and have a sleep. I think I better stimulate my grey cells a little bit and poison my brain with a bit of entertainment. Those voices are going to continue talking to you. It's called the serpent. Smart people know that it's not smart to listen to the voice in your head. Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life. people that have achieved and excelled in any endeavour, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's sport, whether it's business, whatever, they actually read books on psychology, and they know that as soon as they say to themselves, I'm going to achieve in a particular endeavour, they know that there will be voices in their head saying, it's too hard, can't do it. Not today, tomorrow. And they know that they, if they want to achieve, have to say no to those voices and say yes to the cause that they've espoused. And that cause is by saying yes to another voice. And that voice is the voice of God. And if we're going to achieve victory, if we're going to be conquerors and leaders, young people, Joshua says, therefore, for this reason, you've got to set yourself and discipline yourself on a course of courage, because it takes courage to obey God. It's not for wimps, because wimps listen to the voices in their head that say, no, it's too hard. Just do what makes you happy. Do what everyone else is doing. Don't be too hard on yourself. Take the easy road. Take the wide gate. Take the wide way. You've got to be courage. If you're going to commit yourself to be a leader, to have victory, to overcome, you've got to have courage to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, and don't turn aside, because you're going to be tested to just turn off right or turn off left. Cleave to Yahweh your God, as you've done to this day. Take good heed unto yourselves, therefore, to love Yahweh your God. That's how you overcome. By obedience. Because you know, obedience is not going to get us into the kingdom. Obedience harnesses a supernatural power and blessing of God that helps us immeasurably achieve our goals. That's what obedience does. And God, through Joshua, appeals to the nation. You obey God. You have the courage to please God and to say yes to God and to follow His law, and you'll be blessed beyond measure. Supernatural help, because God will achieve victory on behalf of you, and all of your enemies will just sink into the dust. Just obey me, devote your life to me, and I'll do the rest. And that is as true today as it was in the days of Joshua. But Joshua said, don't turn. Because as soon as you set your sights on the kingdom and you devote yourself to obey God, those voices are going to say, turn left, turn right. They'll even actually automatically put the indicator on for you so you don't have to worry. That's a big danger. Being distracted and being diverted is where sin in its present form, particularly technology, has really mastered its skill to dominate our lives. And you know, as much as I know, that technology is based on the psychology of us wanting to be distracted from doing it tough and to setting ourselves on a course of being productive and to achieve our goal. The world just says distraction, distraction, diversion, diversion. Our phone beeps and something else flashes here. The world is built on distracting and diverting us off course. And Joshua says, you stay on course. Don't turn left. Don't turn right. Keep your eyes fixed on where you're going, because you'll be diverted and you'll get yourself into trouble. And it's important for us, if we've got challenges with technology distracting us and diverting us, be smart and be proactive and do something about getting them out of reach to the point where they don't distract you from commitment to the truth, from commitment to God, from obedience to God. And if that means don't allow your mobile phone into your bedroom or into other parts of the house because of that distraction, well, have the courage to do it. Because the kingdom depends on us overcoming. And we're too weak. We give in too easily. Because we like to be distracted. Oh, what's this? Oh, what's that? Oh, I haven't seen this. Oh, what about this? And our productivity goes out the window as far as our course of overcoming is concerned. So let's be smart. Let's be smarter than the world. And let's not allow ourselves to be distracted to the left or to the right. Separation. It's going to help us overcome. If we are focused on the kingdom and we're fighting an enemy, don't befriend the enemy. These verses, verse 7, verse 12 and verse 13, were totally ignored in the times of the judges, as we know. Joshua warns the people about getting friendly with the Canaanites. Come not among the nations, he says, that remain among you. Don't even make mention of the name of their gods. Don't speak about them. Don't let the names of their gods come out of your mouth. Don't swear by them. Don't serve them. Don't bow down to them. If you do, and instead of cleaving to Yahweh, you cleave to the remnant of these nations and you make the Canaanites your friends because you think they're nice guys, and you start making marriages with them, I'm telling you, God's no more going to help you drive out the Canaanites, and they're going to stay there because they're going to be snares and traps and scourges in your sides and thorns in your eyes, and you're going to perish from this good land. That warning was totally lost on the generations that we know commenced in the book of the Judges, because they forgot the importance of good spiritual leadership in their own personal lives, in their marriages, in their families, in their ecclesias, in their tribes, in the nation. Because they said, yeah, Joshua, you don't realise, like, we live in a modern world. Like, Joshua lived like, he's a couple of generations ago. Like we're talking about the 40s and 50s. Like, come on. I mean, we live in the modern world. This is 2018. What would Joshua know about the world we live in? You look, he might have said that because, he was quite an extremist, Joshua. Like, he sort of thought that, we would get infected by some disease if we made these Canaanites our friends. Oh, that's rubbish. They're good people. They're religious people. You should see them. They're really nice. And their kids play with our kids and we get on like a house on fire. All of this business about the danger of these people. I mean, that's a load of rubbish. Honestly, get with it. I mean, anyway, that's how I see it. I mean, that's my perspective on the situation. That's just how I see it. And that's what it means when we read that every man did that which was right in his own eyes. They all just had their own personal opinion. It was different to Joshua's, sure, but that's just how they saw it. I mean, that's just my perspective. That's just how I see it. Dumb. Dumb. Because God is always right. And people that have their own opinion and don't consult God for his opinion are dumb. Because they destroy themselves, they destroy their children, they destroy the ecclesia, and that's history. Because that's what happened. Because people lost the legacy of Joshua and became weak at the knees. Because they just thought, this is just my opinion. This is how I see things. This is just my perspective on the situation. Get your eyes off the scriptures and off the word of God and you'll end up in the same place. What does the Apostle Paul say? This is not an Old Testament exhortation by Joshua. Paul brings it into modern times for the ecclesia in Corinth. He said, don't be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. What fellowship is righteousness with unrighteousness? What communion has light with darkness? What concord has Christ with Belial? Or what part is he that believeth with an infidel? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? Because you're the temple of the living God. As God has said, I want to dwell in you and I want to walk in you and I want to be your God and I want you to be my people. So come out from among them and be ye separate. There's the warning of Joshua's exhortation. saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you. And I will be a father unto you, and you will be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty. Separation. Separation from the unclean, and separate from the unclean things. Joshua says there's consequences for disobedience. And in verse 15 and 16 he says, therefore it will come to pass that all the good things that have come upon you, which Yahweh your God has promised you, so shall Yahweh bring evil things upon you until you're destroyed. And when you transgress the covenant of Yahweh your God, which he commanded you, and have gone and served other gods and bowed yourselves to them, the anger of Yahweh will be kindled against you, and you'll perish quickly from off the good land that Yahweh hath given you. And you know, because we know history from this point onwards, and know that Joshua actually prophesied of the corruption and the apostasy of the ecclesia, and God's judgment upon the ecclesia, Israel from that time right through to the modern era of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany and in Europe have always been evidence to us that God means what he says. What nation has had unbelievably good experiences and yet on the other hand, unbelievably evil experiences like Israel? Look at their history from Joshua's day to the present. You tell me another nation that you've seen rise to incredible heights of supernatural assisted achievement, and on the other hand, sunk to atrocities committed against them that you and I would find it difficult even to believe, even though we go to the museums or read about what happened to the Jewish people. It's because of what God said would happen. You obey me, unbelievable good will be your experience. After all I've done for you, you turn your back on me and you go into the world and be part of the world, your experience will be unbelievably evil. And we've got the nation of Israel to prove to us that God means what he says. There's consequences for disobedience. So why was God so concerned about them being separate from the idolatrous practices of the Canaanites? If you've got a Rotherham's translation, Rotherham has an appendix at the end of the book of Joshua in Rotherham's Emphasized Bible, and I've just given a little snapshot of an appendix as to why God commanded Joshua to exterminate the Canaanites. Because we might not appreciate, unless we actually study this area, why the Canaanites were so bad and why Joshua said, keep separate and utterly destroy every living, breathing Canaanite, man, woman, child, animal. Don't let any survive. This is what Rotherham says. In reviewing the destruction of the nations of Canaan, it's most important to bear in mind the terrible nature of the crimes for which they were exterminated. Their worship was repulsive immorality, grossly sensual and revoltingly cruel. In honour of their deities, women surrendered their virtue. Their sacred places were centres of harlotry. The generative organs were openly represented by obscene, disgusting symbols. The people had holy harlots, male and female. Lustful gods were cruel and demanded to be worshipped with human blood. Hence to the king idol Molech or Baal and the queen idol Ashtoreth, the Canaanites with some of their surrounding nations sacrificed their sons and daughters. At such crimes as these, nature shudders, and Palestine was fain in abhorrence to eject her inhabitants. Who shall say that the Most High has not the right to extinguish such polluters of the earth and contaminators of mankind as these? So idolatry was not just people just like doing this kind of thing before pieces of wood and stone. Oh no. No. It was sexually immoral. It was violently cruel. And these practices were part of pagan stupidity that lost all sense of decency and respect for human life. In every respect. And God says and describes the abomination of the Canaanites in explicit detail. If you want to read Leviticus and all of the things that God said the Canaanites practiced, God didn't mince words. He didn't just fairy tale why he warned them against Canaanite association, he spelled out in black and white the kind of atrocities and sexual immorality that the Canaanites were known for. And he said, you have anything to do with these, they will corrupt you, and I will destroy them I will destroy you like I've destroyed them. And that's why it's important for us to realise this exhortation the Apostle Paul gave the Corinthians when he said, there's no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. Because the issues that Joshua had to contend with and Israel had to contend with are no different to the issues we have to contend with today. Nothing is new. This is common to man. Idolatry has always been the downfall of God's ecclesia. And it destroyed the ecclesia. All of its history, it dogged the ecclesia's steps until, of course, it was finally destroyed and taken into Babylon. So don't think that this is Old Testament stuff, that there's no relevance to our personal challenge in idolatry in its present form. But, Paul says, God is faithful. He's not going to suffer you to be tempted above that you're able. But with the temptation, God will also make a way to escape so that you may be able to bear it. Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. Because idolatry has a present form. Just come to Ephesians chapter 5. And this is what stands between us and our inheritance. Here's an exhortation that the Apostle Paul gave, and I couldn't really improve on this, which is why I think I would just like to use the Apostle Paul's exhortation to help us appreciate the challenges we face and the dangers of idolatry, because that's what stands between us and our inheritance. Ephesians chapter 5. A beautiful exhortation the Apostle Paul gave about how to really be God's true children, as our Lord Jesus Christ was. So verse 3, Paul says, fornication, uncleanness, covetousness, let it not be once named among you as becometh saints, neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor jesting, which are not befitting, but rather giving of thanks. For this ye know, that no whoremonger, nor unclean person, nor covetous man, who is an idolater. So you can summarise verse 3 to verse 5 to that point as idolatry, because all of those words are a description of what idolatry involved. And idolatry keeps us out of the kingdom. Paul says, know this, that if we're part of idolatrous practices, we have no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Let no man deceive you with vain words, he says in verse 6. For because of these things cometh the wrath of God upon the children of disobedience. So don't be partakers with them. Don't be involved in these practices. What are we talking about? Fornication, comes from the Greek word porneia, from which we get our English word pornography. It describes anything that is of a sexual nature that is illicit. And scripturally speaking, the only sexual activity that is sanctioned by God is that which is between a husband and a wife who are married. So sexual sin is fornication. Uncleanness, the word means impurity, filth. And of course our world is full of filth. Filthy minds, filthy language, filthy habits, perverse practices, damaging behaviour, substance abuse, which includes many things. Paul says all uncleanness, covetousness, means to be greedy, to have things to excess, even of legitimate things. The word filthiness means obscenities, shameful behaviour, indecent behaviour. The word foolish talking comes from a Greek word morologia, which means, well, literally, it's like talking like morons. So moron and logos are the two root words. Buffoonery, stupidity, blasphemy, swearing, foul mouth. And jesting, the Greek word eftherapia, means to be so clever of wit so that you can speak good or well, but insinuate vulgarity. It is the mantra of today's comedians. And all suggestive language and loose jokes all comes under that term jesting. And Paul says that these activities are not befitting. They're not befitting God's children. And people that engage in these activities or drool over those who do are idolaters, Paul says, and have no inheritance. So idolatry stands between us and our inheritance, just like it was when Joshua gave his final speech to the children of Israel. And don't let any man deceive you with vain words, says the Apostle Paul. Because people will try and deceive you like the serpent tried to deceive Eve. Oh, don't be so, extreme. I mean, God knows that we have to have a little bit of, enjoyment, fun, relaxation, entertainment. I mean, you can hear the serpent speaking, can't you? Don't take God too serious. I mean, he's not going to keep you out of the kingdom for this kind of stuff. I mean, really, you won't surely die. So Paul says, don't be deceived. Eve was. Don't be partakers with them. You were sometimes darkness, but you're light. So walk as children of the light. Do things that are wholesome. Verse 9, that conducively produce fruits of the Spirit in you. Verse 10, proving what is acceptable to the Lord. I've heard people say, I've got no problem with this. And my reply is, do you know what? I couldn't care, because your opinion doesn't matter. Paul says, proving what is acceptable to the Lord. Is it acceptable to God? That's the criteria, not whether it's acceptable to you, because I don't really care what's acceptable to you. Your standards don't really matter. Paul says, is it acceptable to God? Read your Bible and find out. Don't have any fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. Condemn the practices. It's a shame even to speak of those things which are done of them in secret. Joshua says, don't even let the names of their gods come out of your mouth. Don't even talk about the stuff they do, let alone reading about the gossip, about all of the things that they get up to. That stuff is outside our scope of interest, because the light's going to make manifest what's right. So Paul says in verse 14, wake up and get a life. Well, that's how I translate verse 14. Awake thou that sleepest, and arise from the dead. And walk circumspectly, verse 15, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. So don't waste time on stuff that's going to take you off course. Sorry about getting a bit excited. Be careful. Just come back to Matthew chapter 5, because the greatest overcomer, the greatest champion, the greatest legend, the man who achieved the greatest victory in overcoming the flesh and ruling the spirit, gave us some very good advice. So this advice comes from the greatest leader of all time. And Joshua had warned the nation and their leaders that if they didn't make proactive decisions to maintain separation from things that would cause offence, that they would get into trouble. And there would be snares and traps that they would leave in their way that would trip them over and make them stumble. Here's Jesus' advice in the context in Matthew 5 of looking after a woman, verse 28, and lusting after her, which is like committing adultery with her in his heart. So he's talking about not actually committing adultery, but fantasizing about it through our eyes. So that's the context, okay? So we got the context of the Lord's words about sinning with our eyes. Now, in that context, he says in verse 29, if your right eye offends you, that is, it causes you to stumble in the truth, pluck it out and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. And he repeats the same with the right hand. Now, of course, that's a parable. Okay, Jesus is not asking us literally to go and just take our eye out and throw it away. But in the parable, he's talking about things that have a legitimate use. Yep, an eye has a legitimate use. And so does a hand. And it would be painful to actually have to cut it off and do without it, yep? You'd be losing some legitimate use from that eye and from that hand. But Jesus' parable teaches us that if there are things that have legitimate uses, and even if those uses have a divine legitimacy because God made our eye and God made our hand, if those same things are causing us to trip up and stumble in our walk towards the kingdom, Jesus did not say, you just got to be as tough as I am, guys, and just learn not to let your eye and your hand offend you. Is that what he said? No, he didn't. He said, and this is his advice, cut it off, throw it away. And for me, that had to be a television, because I cannot resist the temptation. And if I was to take a television, which I don't have, but if I was brought up with it, because you know I was brought up in the world, and I put it in the shed, I can tell you, if I ever heard on the radio or saw somewhere in the shopping centre an ad for things, and not Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and Three Stooges and stuff like that, that's not what I enjoy watching. If I was to consult my flesh, that TV would be out of the shed in the lounge room, or I'd be in the shed watching it. And because of that, I cannot have a TV. And I do not judge people with a TV. I'm just saying I had to be honest with myself and say I had to do without that. Because honestly, I cannot resist the temptation. And thankfully, Jesus said I'm not hopeless and useless and worthless because I can't control a TV. Thankfully, Jesus encourages me to say, do you know, sometimes we have to make those decisions. Those honest decisions, because we know how easily we can be tempted and distracted, and those snares and traps, we can have them, we can bring them into our lives because we're not smart enough to make the decisions necessary to get rid of them. Yes, we might have to do without some of the legitimate use of those things. So I might have to do without being up to date with the news or current affairs or National Geographic channel. I think you can buy National Geographic as a channel. Okay, I might have to do without that. But you know, I'd rather be in the kingdom than to be up to date with the news on TV. I'll find another way. A way that's not going to trip me up and distract me to watch stuff that I shouldn't be watching or to waste time that I don't have. Joshua says, I'm going to die. My battle's finished. But I'm telling you, and you know in your hearts and in your souls, that not one thing has failed of all the good things which Yahweh your God spake concerning you. All have come to pass, and not one thing hath failed thereof. Do you know what that tells me, young people? I find that verse 14, so encouraging, because Joshua is telling the people, God will never let you down. He will never leave one thing undone that He's promised for you. Not one thing. And He says, you know in your heart of hearts and in your souls that God has done everything He said. So if we get to the judgment seat, young people, and pray God this be not any of our experiences, and we miss out on the kingdom, you and I should know in our heart of hearts that it was not because God let us down. Because God will never let us down. He will do things that are beyond our wildest comprehensions. He has supernatural power. He has promised, and He will never let us down. There's nothing that He can't do to get us into the kingdom. If we want to be in the kingdom, He'll get us there. But we can only blame ourselves, because it won't be Him that we can blame. He has done everything possible to give us the kingdom, and He's given that to us as a promise, and God never breaks His promises. So let's have dominion. That's what God created us for. And Jesus said, he that overcometh and keepeth my works to the end, and you've got to endure to the end, to him will I give power over the nations, and he will rule with them. Young people, if you ever look at this world and you feel sorry for people who are oppressed and who are the victims of atrocities and exploitation, if you ever cry to see the mess that this world is in and you want to do something to fix it, well, you fix that evil in your nature and God will give you divine nature to be the kings and priests of this world, to fix all of the problems and to hold all of those evil men and women to account and bring judgment upon them and relieve the oppressed and those that suffer. If you care, make a difference. Because this dominion that we are asked to have over our own spirit is training for being the rulers who will bring God's kingdom to this earth, when God's dominion will restore peace by righteousness to this wearied planet. As we said, Joshua didn't know that his life would be recorded for other people to read. Our lives are written in God's book of remembrance. You know that? It's all recorded. So what if God published that book for the benefit of the mortal population? So a book from the time when the apocalypse finished, a book of the history of the world and the Christadelphians or the faithful believers for the benefit of the mortal population in the kingdom. And they're going to read about your life. How will that read? What legacy are you going to give to the mortal population? Joshua didn't know that a book was going to be written so that his words and his life would inspire others. What will our legacy be? It's a question we need to ask ourselves. I don't know if that book will be published, by the way. I have no inspired revelation to say that it will. But what if, those in the Old Testament didn't know that it was going to be written. Job said, that a book was written. He didn't know, and nor did the apostles. But it's written for our learning and our admonition. So if your life is part of that record, con Mitsos, how will his life be written up? What legacy will be communicated to the mortal population of the world to come? Well, we decide that now, don't we? We decide what gets written against our name. If we really want to be in the kingdom with Joshua, if we really want our inheritance, we need to stand strong. It's time to stand strong. Even if you have been disappointed about your past or your life from the perspective of looking back and you think, I can do better. You know that God is able to wipe from his memory a past that has been turned away from. And he can start your story again from today, from 8:39 tonight. And you can rewrite history, your history and your legacy. Stand strong. Stand strong in purpose. Stand strong in commitment. Stand strong in separation from the world. Stand strong in obedience to God. Stand strong in faith. Stand strong in battle. Because if you do, you'll be into the promised land.